Welcome. I'm Erik Fleming, host of A Moment with Erik Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Erik Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenterik.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NVG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Erik Fleming. I am your host, Erik Fleming. And so today I have 3 guests. 2 of them have gotten together and written a book dealing with equity, justice in public education. And I have a returning guest to talk about the significance of 100 years of Black history in the United States. So we got a long show, so I'm not going to get into it, too deep in the intro. We just going to kick it off as always. Please look to support the show on www.momenterik.com. Whatever you can do, donations, subscriptions, whatever, greatly appreciate it. But like I said, this is a jam-packed show, so we're going to kick it right on off. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Erik. President Trump condemned but refused to apologize for a racist video allegedly posted on his social media account by a staffer depicting the Obamas as apes. A federal judge ordered the release of body cam footage and evidence in the case of Marimar Martinez, a teacher shot by a Border Patrol agent in Chicago. Ghislaine Maxwell invoked her Fifth Amendment rights during a congressional deposition in an attempt to secure clemency from President Trump. A grand jury declined to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers after the Justice Department attempted to charge them for advising military members to refuse illegal orders. The House of Representatives approved the Save America Act to require proof of citizenship for midterm elections. The House also narrowly passed a resolution to end President Trump's national emergency-based tariffs on Canada. An immigration judge stopped deportation proceedings against a Tufts University student after the government failed to justify revoking her visa over a pro-Palestinian editorial. A New York federal judge unfroze $16 billion for the New York-New Jersey Gateway Rail project, overruling the Trump administration's blocking of the funds. Ana Lilia Mejia defeated 10 other candidates in the Democratic primary for the vacant New Jersey 11th congressional district seat. A federal judge struck down a California law prohibiting federal officers from wearing masks. A California appeals court temporarily allowed the Trump administration to go ahead with ending deportation protections for nearly 89,000 migrants from Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua. A Georgia man was sentenced to over 3 years in prison for threatening President Trump during a TikTok live stream. And A Texas developer will pay $68 million to settle a civil rights case over fraudulent land sales to Hispanics. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my guests, Dr. Decoteau Irby and Dr. Ishimaru. Decoteau J. Irby is a father, author, artist, and educator who works each and every day to advance education equity and justice for Black and brown children and youth in community spaces, schools, and districts, and higher education. His core philosophy is that when you improve learning conditions and opportunities through providing abundant resources and affirming support, children and young people's aspirations, efforts, and high-level academic performance will follow. Professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, he teaches in the College of Education's top-ranked Urban Education Leadership Program, co-directs the UIC Center for Urban Education Leadership, and leads the Brothers Teaching Initiative. He organizes Bronzeville's Juneteenth Youth Baseball and Softball Tournament, tends community gardens, and advocates for vibrant public spaces on Chicago's South Side. A self-taught guitarist, songwriter, and occasional performer, he has released 3 music projects under the name Decoteau Black, exploring Black love, struggle, and liberation. Dr. Ann M. Ishimaru is an award-winning scholar, writer, educator, and the Killinger Endowed Chair and Professor of Educational Foundations, Leadership, and Policy at the University of Washington College of Education. Through her work, she cultivates the leadership and solidarities of educators, organizational leaders, and racially minoritized youth, families, and communities to realize more transformative futures. In addition to many peer-reviewed articles in top-tier educational research journals, she is also the author of Just Schools, Building Equitable Collaborations with Families and Communities. And we will be discussing today this book that they've collaborated on called Doing the Work of Equity Leadership for Justice and Systems. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as guests on this podcast Dr. Decoteau Irby and Dr. Ishimaru. All right. Normally when I have these podcasts, I usually just have one person smarter than me at the other end, but now I got 2. Dr. Decoteau Irby and Dr. Ishimaru. Maru, I'm sorry. How y'all doing? Y'all doing good?
Doing good.
Doing right. Thank you.
Okay. So I wanted to, I'm glad that y'all are on because we're going to talk about education and at least as it relates to leadership. Y'all co-edited or wrote. I don't know how exactly that works, but y'all oversaw a book being printed called Doing the Work of Equity Leadership for Justice and Systems. And which is very, very intense. I must say, I got to reading it and I was like, oh boy, I'm back in school again, but it's a good read and it's very appropriate. And I want y'all to get into the meat of how y'all came about putting this together and talk about the essence of the book. But before we do that, I do what we call an icebreaker segment. So the first icebreaker is a quote that I want y'all to respond to. And the quote is, when equity leadership is in addition to, instead of a priority, it gets placed on the back burner. What does that quote mean to you?
You want to get it? You want me to go first, Ann? Yeah.
You go. You start.
Yeah. So thank you for pulling that quote out, and thank you for having us on your podcast as well. We glad to be here. So when we have that that statement that when equity leadership is an add-on as opposed to at the center, what we're talking about there is in many schools and many districts, they don't try to embody and integrate commitments to equity and justice into everything they're doing. They do them kind of like after the fact. I like to call it add-on equity. So you make a bunch of decisions. You have, let's say, for example, a hiring process. You don't have commitments to equity baked into the hiring process. So you don't have the kind of language and qualifications that make the applicants have to come with the understanding and a demonstrated track record of their commitment to like equity, anti-racism, and so on and so forth. Instead, you do a general race neutral hiring process. And then after the hiring process, once you realize your pool or the people who either your pool of candidates or the people who you want to offer the position to don't reflect our society, don't reflect the people who you will be serving in your school community, then you say, now we need to do something to figure out how to get some more people who look like our students, some more people who relate to the communities. That B approach would be adding on, right? That would be leading and seeking out and trying to kind of like fill in, compensate for the inadequacies of that candidate pool and for who you actually saw as viable teachers or leaders in your district. The first approach where you're writing a job description, you're creating an interview panel with people from the community, with students who can understand what these folks bring, that you're making sure that the qualifications reflect the commitment. And the leadership part is making sure that the interview process and the recruitment process has all of that baked in from the very idea that you want to bring people in, as opposed to a kind of neutral, we're going to hire and see who we get. We know what happens when there's not a commitment, intentional commitment at the front end. Then you kind of do the add-on piece. So that's just one example. And in a lot of schools and a lot of districts, we see people having a commitment to equity in order to fix the inequitable ways that they're already engaged in. And that's what I consider kind of like add-on equity, right? So equity leadership where you add something on as opposed to it being something that you have thought about from the very beginning.
Dr. Irby, I love one of the phrases that you use near the end is something being baked in. And it made me think of Terrence Green, who's a colleague, one of the co-authors in the book. He talks about the idea of equity sprinkles. So, people are always trying to like sprinkle this stuff on the top when it isn't, the cake. He tells the story about a friend who baked a cake that just was terrible. And no matter how many sprinkles you put on the top, it's not going to actually fix that cake. You actually have to start over from scratch and bake these things in, as you go. And I'm thinking also about Maurice Sweeney, who is another co-author on one of the chapters. He talks about this sort of dynamic where people expect people to do these initiatives. They want a new program. They want an initiative. And what happens when you do all these just initiatives or programs is they tend to sit off to the side as their own separate thing rather than actually integrating across all the different work that happens in a school or in a system. So that quote really, I think, brings all of those dynamics to mind.
Okay. All right. So now this will be a collaborative effort, I guess. I need you all to give me a number between 1 and 20.
14.
Oh, okay. So 14. All right.
Okay. What does the idea of a better world mean to you?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I'm going to let you start off, Ann. I started the first question.
All right. Oh, I actually love this question. I think it's a question that we need to be asking more often. Because I think this sort of muscle that we have of imagining something other than what we already have is underdeveloped, as we can feel so attacked by all of the broader dynamics, these long histories of racism and white supremacy, and then like the in the moment stuff that we can sort of only be limited by what we can imagine in this moment within these bounds. So for me, I think about what is it like a future of thriving where communities are able to be self-determining, where we think about kids learning that's not bound just by the four walls of the school, but is expanding out into the community, and that we think about success not only as kids, getting good grades, doing well in school and graduating, but actually being able to develop habits for learning things that are important to them, that are making change in the world to make it a better place, and building a sense of responsibility and kind of collective investment in the thriving everyone in their community.
Yeah. When I think about what a better world would mean, it would be for me a place. The word that comes to mind is for me is dignity, where people would experience a sense of dignity. And by dignity, I mean really this deep kind of sense of self-worth and a recognition of self-worth combined with the capacity to see the self-worth of other people and other things, right? So for example, our environment. And it's not just a sense of self for just oneself, which I always remind people that it has to be a both, right? You can see the value in yourself. You can also see the value and the worth in other people. Martin Luther King called this somebodyness. He talked quite a bit about somebodyness, especially when he started talking about economic justice, militarism, and racism. And he really was, a lot of times started talking about we're working towards achieving a kind of sense of somebodyness where everybody feels like they're a person. So I feel like that's what, in the tradition that I work in, that's what I think a better world would look like, a place where people can experience that. And how that relates to children in schools, of course, the schools would be developing and cultivating a sense of worth amongst children. It would also be helping them see the value of all of the people who are in front of them and the people who they're going to encounter throughout their life. So I know that's a big, broad philosophical way of thinking about it, but that's what I think. And more concretely, that means economic security, housing security, food security. And when I say security, I'm specifically speaking about the experience of waking up in the morning and being able to anticipate that you're going to have your needs met that day, every day. So that's what, and that can be like safety. That can be all of these different things. When I say security, it's not just about, it's a sense of predictability, relative predictability that you're going to be okay walking through the world. And a lot of people don't have that, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what was the motivation behind this book?
Well, there's kind of a couple of stories, but, one of them has to do with the two of us and then also Dr. Terrence Green sitting around probably 2016 and starting to realize that we had colleagues, friends, people we knew in our own areas who were starting to take up this role of equity director and equity leadership and, saying, what do we know about this role? How is this emerging in multiple places? So I'm in the Northwest. Decoteau was in Chicago. Terrence is in Texas. I'm realizing this isn't just something that's happening locally, but it's starting to happen nationally. I know you're in Atlanta. Atlanta also has these roles. And trying to figure out sort of at the moment what's going on, what are these folks doing, and how is that making change, especially for the folks who are living this every day, living in educational injustices. But then it sort of became this much broader thing as we undertook this research across almost 10 years. And then we tried to make sense of what is happening across time. So we have this notion that leadership matters and context matters. And leadership is contextual, right? But we wanted to get more specific than that. So, okay, yeah, we can say something different is happening. The conditions are different in Atlanta than they are in Chicago, than they are in Seattle. But we're also seeing that across time, the social political dynamics are changing in really dramatic ways. So I'm gonna cue up Decoteau here because the way that we organized our book has to do with these cycles of equity leadership. And so we're talking about how there was a kind of awakening in 2014 or so that brought us all the way up to when the book came out, and then the dynamics that are happening right now in 2026. I queued Decoteau up to kind of share that piece of the story.
Yeah. So we really the book covers a period from the end of the Obama administration, which we situate kind of like the emergence of these equity leaders at the end of the Obama administration, right around the time when, George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. We heard the 911 calls. It created kind of this awakening, this consciousness in our country for a relatively very brief moment of time. We had Million Hoodies movement. This is when we saw the initial seed of the Black Lives movement being planted in the social media space and in the digital media space. And then we kind of like fast forward to the election of Donald Trump, right? 2016. Then we move forward to George Floyd being murdered by Derek Chauvin. And through all of these periods, what we argue is that this awakening ushered in a moment of where people wanted to do something. People wanted to take action. And the initial thing that a lot of districts started to do was to hire these equity leaders, these equity directors. So these people started to do things like create the policies that we see in a lot of districts throughout the country right now. Unfortunately, many of them have been rolled back since Trump's first year in office with his executive orders. But these are people who created equity policies, created affinity spaces. They started to look at data different kind of ways. They started to think about professional development of teachers and leaders in different kind of ways. And then we saw some more outward forward kind of things like school districts starting to celebrate Juneteenth, those sorts of things. Fast forward, and then we move into a period that we call midday. So we had awakenings and mornings. And by midday, we saw substantial investment. This was 2020 with the COVID pandemic and the racial uprisings that resulted from Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd. And we saw a proliferation of equity kind of activity and substantial resources invested in this kind of work, right? And so we call this midday, where things were in the open. You could be Black Lives Matter, you could be Trans Lives Matter, you could be all of these different things openly, and you wouldn't face as much hostility. But the hostility throughout this entire period was continually bubbling underneath, which eventually led to people doing things like, trying to take over school boards, book bans, all of these different sorts of things. So there's backlash to this proliferation of equity and justice, consciousness and action and leadership in schools. And before long, we moved into a period that we call evenings. And the evenings are when the activity started to be more subdued. People are not saying anti-racism anymore. They might be saying like student belonging and cultural relevance, but they might not be focused on the specific intentional language around like Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing. And what we argue at the end of the book is that we're now in a period of night. We were supposed to get this book into the publisher in November of 2024. And like academics do, we were late. And it was actually a silver lining, a blessing in disguise, because the election happened in 2024. Trump was elected for a second term. And by January, of course, he issued this record number of executive orders repealing basically everything that goes back to the Obama administration's effort. And then shortly thereafter, even things that go back to the 1960s. So we argue now that we're in a period of night. And one of the questions that we are raising with people as we travel around and as we're on podcasts and we're having conversations about this book is the question of what do we do and how do we lead for equity and justice under the cover of night when it's a nighttime. So that's a little bit about a broad overview of the conceptual framing of the book.
So since you brought that up, how has the current Trump administration impacted retention of equity leaders and programs?
Yeah, all over the place, folks. We've noticed that people are losing these roles, or they're being transitioned to other roles, or their departments or titles are being changed to something else. So it depends on the state context in particular, where, there are some states where, they've just eliminated these roles entirely. In other states, they're transitioning to different language. But it's affected all of them. And I think one of the things that we always want to kind of bring up too is like, even though the social political context has been changing so much over this relatively short period of time, one of the through lines has been the leadership of Black women in particular in these roles and in equity leadership, even when they're not in these roles. Because the sort of like after that initial research that we did, we continued on, but we expanded it to think about who are the many different players in a given educational system who are leading for equity, who don't necessarily have just that one singular role. So one of the things that we're seeing is that Black women were really at the vanguard. And again, that's not new. That's been the case since way before this time. But it also means that they are likely disproportionately losing their roles. We know that that's the case nationally in terms of other leadership roles. So I think education is very much following in that pattern. And, I think that's it. I think there's a kind of twofold. One, like we're coming out of this time when that kind of professionalization of equity in systems, it was pretty new and it was very brief. But it doesn't mean that even though these folks are moving into different positions or the positions themselves are changing into other things, it doesn't mean though that the work isn't happening. It means that too is having to change.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is that the speed and kind of intensity of this current backlash, under this second Trump administration is very intense. But it's important to understand that even historically looking back, these were never easy roles for people to be in. The people who were in these roles were, Anne has a chapter in the book about this idea of this paradox of of being a person of color, mostly the people are people of color, women of color, asked to change a system that is actually designed to kind of like destroy who you are, right? And so even though we saw a period where the roles and the equity leadership activities in districts was well resourced, the resources don't necessarily mean that the work itself was easy, because the way that, white supremacy works is that it gets into the nooks and crannies and crevices however it needs to. And so this meant that like folks experienced, all kinds of, what I call mundane racial violence, these small everyday instances of racism at work that really wear people down and give them racial battle fatigue over time. So people experience that kind of thing. People experience death threats to their families. A lot of people left these roles because, they were in districts and in regions of the country where people were extremely hostile to even the idea of celebrating Black History Month, for example. And especially for the people who were doing equity work around LGBTQI students and gender nonconforming students, having policies to make sure either they're represented in the curriculum, that they're not discriminated against at school. Those sorts of things were the things that actually had that people were under attack for championing those kinds of causes on behalf of young people and communities. So I do want to say that like now I think the level of intensity and in particular, the federal government's role in supporting the attacks is different than we had in years past. But the attacks have been happening at multiple different levels, municipal level, district level, state level, for example. In Texas has been going on for a while. All of these kinds of different things, these attacks have been happening. And so how I kind of see it is that right now, the districts that didn't want equity and leadership and justice work happening in their schools now have multiple layers of weight of enforcement to stop and to thwart the work that's actually happening. So I just wanted to mention that because this particular era is new and I think different, but also there's some continuity in terms of how people have been treated who try to do work on behalf of children who historically schools haven't worked well to represent, educate, or, set up for life success.
So let's dig into the paradox a little bit. How does the paradox of education that James Baldwin talked about create challenges in reshaping the educational system? And Dr. Irby, you set it up pretty good. So, Dr. Ishimaru, do you want to add on to that or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so. I'm thinking especially about, I want to, like Shannon Page Clark wrote a chapter called Shock to the System. She talks about the Black women's leadership in especially what she calls nice white districts, which, I think in many ways, even districts where she argues that even in districts that are not predominantly white, the dynamics of nice whiteness are often playing out, in schools and in systems amongst the adults. So I think the paradox is, on the one hand, these are folks who bring enormous expertise. Often we found like the Black women often had like more credentials and more higher education. They had a lot of experience, often in the classroom and at different levels of the system. And then they bring their own lived experiences. And then at the same time, their identities are sort of the kind of expertise that they bring isn't valued. It's often undermined. So she talks about these dynamics where, like, people are sitting around a table, the equity director or an equity leader, especially a Black woman, will be trying to weigh in and talk about, say, there's a social emotional learning curriculum, for example, and there is a need to address how that plays out differently for children of color, children who experience racialized trauma versus children who haven't. But that's not even part of the conversation. So this leader knows that she needs to bring that up and raise that and as an issue that needs to be addressed in that curriculum and the delivery, the implementation. But at the same time, she knows that the people around the table are going to expect her to say something like that. And then there's this automatic sort of undermining of their expertise. So there's this like dynamic where it's their job to go in and disrupt the system. And at the same time, all the dynamics that are operating to maintain the status quo are set up to undermine their leadership and their expertise. They're often seen through these racialized and gendered lenses of being angry or too aggressive, whereas this is a different district now. They would notice a white man would say something very similar, like raise issues around the need for other languages in communications with families that are predominantly Latino. And this other leader would be perceived as, like really passionate and getting down to business and really serious about equity. Whereas the same comment would be raised by a woman of color would be seen as too aggressive, making people uncomfortable. So that's the kind of paradox that these folks are navigating all of the time. And as Dr. Irby said, it has this racial battle fatigue dynamic that plays out in very systematic ways.
Yeah. So explain the significance of the big red truck with the Confederate flag.
Yeah, so this was a story that our colleague Shannon Clark, who's at University of Maryland Eastern Shore, contributed to the book. And so she tells the story of a superintendent of equity and having a conversation where, so this big red truck was sitting out, and this is in the Midwest. This is not, I should say this is not in the South because I'm from South Carolina. So these big red trucks are everywhere in South Carolina. But this was in the Midwest in a place where the Confederate flag is not something that you see frequently. And for someone in the Midwest to fly or have the Confederate flag is like, in my opinion, a kind of deliberate provocation. So at this particular district, there was a truck, a big red truck with the Confederate flag on it that this person would park right in front of the district's entrance to go into the kind of district building. So when people had to go into a board meeting or do any kind of official business with the school district, they walk past this truck. So Dr. Clark was interviewing this superintendent of equity and asked her about the truck because this superintendent of equity is talking about we're trying to make sure, people feel safe, right? Coming to school and they feel like they belong. And so Dr. Clark asked, if the goal is safety and belonging, like what's going on with the big red truck with the Confederate flag on it outside? And it was interesting because the superintendent of equity at the time acknowledged the truck, but had almost done this thing where she blocked the truck out of her mind. Right. And so in that chapter, she writes about these like strategies, these kind of micro strategies that women in particular, Black women, her whole chapter is about Black women, that Black women adopt to be able to do this work, to show up to work, to fight for Black children, Latinx children, right? English language learners. And one of the strategies in that story was that she had kind of blocked it out. And she told Dr. Clark, who was interviewing, like, she said, I'm surprised I know about it. And I'm surprised you brought that up because I've tried to, she was just like, I've noticed it, but I don't notice it. And that's an interesting kind of psychological kind of coping mechanism, this kind of approach that this, leader wasn't even fully aware that she had adopted, that helped her actually be able to show up to work and fight every day. So that chapter is a heavy one because it really writes about the kind of the emotional labor that Black women give. So we think times about labor, about, people moving from school to school, but there's this kind of emotional labor that people who do the work of equity, leadership, and justice give to districts that's not compensated, that's not recognized, that's ignored, that's not talked about. And so that story is a really powerful example of the provocations that people who do this kind of work experience outside of the South, and a powerful example of the kind of strategies and coping mechanisms, whether they're adaptive or maladaptive, that people adopt to try to fight for our children and young people.
Yeah, I know we kind of pressing on time, but I got 3 more questions I really want to ask, and if you will indulge me.
Yes, let's do it.
What is the importance of appreciating the fruits of unsuccessful leadership?
Yeah, this is a chapter. I'll get us started because this is a chapter that Dr. Irby really was part of leading. And so early on, I mentioned that we had done this research with folks who were what we call doing seeding work in this morning time. And at the time, they were doing all of this work with policy, with different stakeholders, with professional development. And you would ask them during this time, and many of them felt like the efforts that they were putting in place weren't realizing the change that they expected and wanted to see in that time. And I think one of the things that the benefit, a lot of research is just like a year, or 9 months or something like that. And maybe at most it's 18 months. One of the benefits that we had of doing this kind of work across such a long period of time is that we could see that what those leaders at the time felt like wasn't successful ended up planting really crucial seeds that the next generation of equity leaders were able to build from. So, for instance, when we get to the daytime, we hear from Maurice Sweeney, and one of the first things he did, actually also this equity leader in the chapter by Dr. Clark also talks about using policies that got developed by folks in the earlier times in other districts, and being able to build from those to think about both what do we not want to do? What are some of the, sort of the roadblocks that we can actually go around, but also what can we build from and move forward in our district? So in retrospect, you can see that all of the kind of the policy work and the ongoing routines that got built into different parts of everyday decision making, for example, in school districts, all of those were kind of seeded in this earlier time. And many of the districts, those leaders turned over before they were able to see those things emerge and come bear fruit. So I think that was they saw it as unsuccessful at the time, but the benefit is that over time we were able to see that it was actually really essential in enabling some of the policies and the practices and the routines and the outcomes that we were able to see in later times.
All right. Why should we avoid the constant cycle of chasing rabbits?
So the kind of like chasing piece and putting out fires, that was the kind of language that a lot of people used. It's exhausting, and it doesn't get people who are doing the work of equity leadership very far. It's not impactful. And what we talk about in terms of like chasing rabbits or putting out fires, this is the practice of when something happens at, let's say there's a district, there's 25 schools in the district. Something happens at school number 5. The equity leader is deployed to school number 5 to try to talk to people, try to figure out what's going on. And then something happens at school number 12. And then they run and try to figure out how they can help the people at school number 12. And then something happens at a board meeting. And then they have to go through a training and they have to help the board figure out and process what's going on. And then somebody sends a message to the superintendent, and then they have to go and counsel and give therapy to the superintendent, the white male superintendent, about what they can do. That's the kind of like putting out fires approach that a lot of people described early on. We're talking 2015, 16, 17, the people who were doing the work right about that time. They were doing a lot of kind of putting out fires, and if they weren't, their districts wanted them to put out a lot of fires. And it was interesting because by the time, thinking about, this idea of planting seeds, by the time, 2020 rolls around, 2019, 2020 rolls around, folks understand coming into the roles that that's not what they're going to be doing, that they can't do that it's not a useful practice. And so we saw a lot less of that, and people described not doing that. And instead, during the midday, people talked a lot about institutionalizing change, right? And so what that meant was, instead of like being in a leadership role where you're going to school 5, school 12, and school 14, instead you're creating the kind of learning processes for professional development and learning that allows you to pull people from every school and get people from every school and build their capacity to address issues at their local site. That meant things like having principals participate in professional development. It meant forming equity leadership teams at the school level. It meant creating student affinity groups like Black Student Unions, Latinos United. It meant making sure that the curriculum is diverse so that people develop the capacity over the time to deal with the issues that emerge in their own setting. And so we started to see equity leadership really be conceptualized as this much more strategic approach to actually facilitating the kind of like institutional changes that makes the putting out fires and chasing rabbits approach obsolete, where you don't need to do that because the system itself starts to develop the capacity, and the people within the system start to develop the capacity to address a lot of these issues without having to call on one individual or a group of people to come and help, quote unquote, save them.
Yeah. All right. In your conclusion, by the way, those last two questions, those are really like very important primers for people in politics, because you can get in and, your term is up, or, you don't get reelected or whatever. And then you look back and say, did I really do what I wanted to do? And then so many years down the road, you see the legislation you pushed through actually bear fruit. And then the other thing is, politics is very reactionary. And it's like, okay, instead of visionary leadership and saying, okay, we're going to introduce this legislation to stop this, right? Because that was a question I always got asked. We're not dealing with this right now. Why are you introducing this bill? And it's like, maybe because we don't want to deal with that in the future. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, that it's not just limited to education, those concepts that y'all talked about. In your conclusion, you quoted Nikki Giovanni. If the enslaved could believe, I know I can. How does that convey what you want readers to take away from this book?
It goes back to that question that you asked us near the beginning, the number 14 question about what is it that we can imagine and work towards. And I think right now in this moment, especially, it's hard to imagine. We've got, like, you think about what's happening in Minneapolis and the kind of assault that young people are and families and communities are experiencing in their schools. It can be really hard to imagine that we could move towards something really different. But I think that's one of the things that we heard over and over again, especially from the Black woman, is that this is generational work. And so we put it in that broader, longer arc of history. We can see, yes, it's sort of like heightened in particular kinds of ways right now. And we have this whole history as Americans of making change and realizing justice across time that we are a part of. That's what this broader effort is about. And so I think, as we're at night now, one of the things that we're seeing as all of these things are getting, like the formal structures are being dismantled, also seeing that the ways that educators and leaders in systems are working strategically to build these networks of community and care. I'm thinking also about like what's happening in Minneapolis and the incredible sort of collective mutual aid and action that's happening there on the ground. And I think about, in particular, there's a chapter near the end about a group of Black principals. They call themselves the Black Lady Principals, who are sort of dissatisfied with the pacing and accountability that was happening at their district level. And they took it upon themselves, not just to kind of lead in their own school context and their own school community, but to actually then connect with each other and develop this network so that their leadership could expand beyond that. So, I always want to say, I think a big lesson takeaway for us from those, from what we've learned in the evening time, but across time, is really don't wait for permission or a role or a charge. That all of us can take that up. Find your people. Don't do it by yourself. And then we all have got to start coloring outside the lines. That's the only thing that's going to help us realize something that might seem improbable or implausible in terms of trying to realize more just schools and communities, but that we didn't get there historically by coloring inside the lines. So we got to be coloring outside the lines.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I add that, there's belief, but there's also these very kind of like small micro practices, these small things that whatever the condition is, whatever who's attacking, there's these small things that people who have experienced oppression do for their children, for their young people that advance them. I grew up in South Carolina, and there's this like tradition with, elders and older people, kind of like, they call it palming. They put a little bit of money in your hand. Nobody sees it though. They kind of get up to you. You did pretty, or you put some effort forward in school, and they put that little dollar in your hands and whisper to you real low, "I'm proud of you. You did good." I imagine that enslaved people did a lot of that. That's resistance. That's not only believing, but telling a person that you believe in them. And I think that, even with my grandmother now, people kind of like, we kind of like laugh at it a little bit, but she looks at us with awe, and a lot of the elders, my granddad, for example, he was amazed that, I wrote books, right? And they were just so proud, like, of that sort of thing. And a lot of that comes from them, the palming, right? It comes from the little encouragement that like nobody else heard. It wasn't it wasn't no speech. It wasn't a big speech. It's these little acts of resistance that help people see a potential that they may not see for themselves if they in the current condition or setting that they're in. And in my mind, I think that enslaved folks did a lot of that. And so I think that even in a time right now where things seem like, well, not seem like, things are, rough for a lot of people. Me, I've never lived through something like this. There's people who have. I have not. I grew up in the 80s, so Black neighborhoods was under siege. But I think that the force of the federal government in particular is a different kind of experience to not have any kind of political redress or recourse, because they're not going to bring charges against anything that happens even at a state or local level, as far as we've seen so far. So, but I think that, if we know we can do things, then we can continue to do them. We don't need the district equity policy for a teacher to palm a student, right? To say, "Hey, I see your effort. You're doing great." And I think that the when you put all of those smaller actions together, it has a big impact. That's what I think. Those actions get us and have gotten us to where we are, and they're going to get us to where we want to go as well. That's what I believe.
All right, guys, finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I grew up in the Black Baptist church in the South, so I would have to say I have hope because like of God and faith. You know what I mean? Like that sounds like I'm at the Grammys. But they say, I feel like that's so, like just that's what people say. But it's kind of like this faith of, and I think also knowing, what people before me have overcome, right? So I think those two things, understanding history and then also just having a faith that things are going to work out some kind of way, somehow.
For me, I have hope because, I'm thinking about Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl, and because love wins, because love is stronger than hate, because, and I'm Buddhist, because things change. That's the nature of the universe, because we're interdependent. we depend on each other. And because, like also from my own history, I'm Japanese American. We're about to come up on the Day of Remembrance, which is February 19th. And 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated by our own government. So my dad was born in one of the camps. So that history is real fresh of the federal government pulling the rug out under a whole swath of folks' feet. 2/3 of us were American citizens. So, but my, community was able to come through that and to pursue reparations. And now are really working to be in solidarity with other communities as all of this is unfolding. So I have faith also from my own histories as well.
All right. So if people want to get this book, how can they do that?
You can get it from all the places that you can get books, Bookshop. If you Amazon, you can do Amazon. And then you can also find out more about the book and about us at our respective websites. So mine is AnneIshimaru.com.
Yep. And my website is DecoteauIrby.com. We're also on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
All right. Well, Dr. Ishimaru, I want to congratulate you and your Seattle Seahawks for winning the Super Bowl.
Thank you.
And Dr. Decoteau Irby, I don't know if you're a Bears fan or a Carolina fan. If you're a Bears fan like me, then we'll be having our parade next year.
I think so.
So I greatly appreciate y'all coming on, seriously. And, this is a very, very important topic because all of our children need to be educated. And I think we cannot place enough emphasis on education. And we want to make sure, as you said in one of your answers, that we want our schools to be a safe place. I always make the statement that if we're going to be good toward our faith, then we have to reach enlightenment. And education leads to enlightenment, right? And so if we don't have the safe spaces for our children, for our next generation, then we're going to continue to have chaos. So I appreciate the research that you have done. I appreciate the collaboration you've had with others to make this so. And I want to encourage y'all to continue to do the good work. And again, I want to thank you all for being on this podcast.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the questions.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really good questions.
Yeah. Terrific questions. Thanks so much.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, we are back. So now it is time for my next guest, Dr. Karlos K. Hill. Karlos K. Hill is a writer, speaker, and community-engaged scholar who brings a deeper perspective to historical racism. Dr. Hill works with students, leaders, and communities to understand our collective past and heal in relation to our most traumatic histories. Dr. Hill is Regents Professor of the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Hill is the author of 3 books, Beyond a Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory, The Murder of Emmett Till, A Graphic History, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History. Dr. Hill founded the Tulsa Race Massacre Oklahoma Teachers Institute to support teaching the history of the race massacre to thousands of middle and high school students. He also serves on the boards of the Freedom Center Planning Committee, the Clara Luper Legacy Committee, and the Board of Scholars Facing History and Ourselves, and is actively engaged on other community initiatives working toward racial justice. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege for the second time to have as a guest on this program Dr. Karlos K. Hill. All right, Dr. Karlos K. Hill. How you doing, brother? Happy Black History Month.
Man, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be a part of your show, be a guest on your show. We always have great conversations, but happy Black History Month to you too.
Yeah. And I understand you're in between classes and stuff, so we're gonna do what we gotta do. That you gave me some interesting background. I might throw that in my editorial or something as we were talking. Okay, that's an interesting scenario you gotta go through. But look, like always, we start this off with a quote, and your quote is, "We must never forget that Black history is American history. The achievements of African Americans have contributed to our nation's greatness." What does that quote mean to you?
Mm. And when I hear that, and if I've said that, I've said it in order to raise our consciousness and to and raise our consciousness, and not only our consciousness in relationship to the contributions of Black people, but for us to really center Black people in American history. And I would argue you don't have an American history without Black people and centering Black people in the nation's history. When slavery is 250 years of our nation's history and responsible for the vast wealth that this society created, Black people and Black people's history are central to American history. And so for me, Black History Month is necessary and has been necessary historically because those contributions have been systematically erased from school books, from textbooks, from knowledge in general. And so Black History Month is a reminder of that erasure, but it's also hopeful. It's a hopeful holiday in that we can learn more, we can improve our understanding and how we see the Black experience as central to American history. There's an aspirational element to Black History Month. And for that reason, I spend a lot of time during February talking to not just to students and audiences, but to Black people in Black contexts about our history. Because often, and the worst consequence of the erasure is that it removes or it prohibits Black people from having an empowering understanding of our history and our place in not just American history, but in world history. You know, Black History Month is seeking to try to address all of that amnesia, all of that erasure. Whether it does it or not is a different thing. But the reason why we have it as a sacred institution is because of the erasure, right? And so I believe that anything that we can do to center Black people and the Black experience and talking about America is not only a good thing, it's transformative. And it's the transformation that we need. So I hope that answers it. But that's kind of that's the place that I teach from.
Okay. So what does the idea of a better world mean to you?
Ubuntu is what better world means to me. Ubuntu, if we could get to an Ubuntu that's Ubuntu and Ubuntu centered understanding of ourselves and the world would be a better place. I try to live my life with great Ubuntu, right? For me, to live a life of great Ubuntu means to live a life not only joy, but to live a life of kindness, of generosity, of compassion for others, right? Grounding myself in that ethic, but also extending that ethic to other people and how I treat them is for me how to lead a life as an individual, but also if we could do that as a collective, right? That's what a better world for me looks like. To go deeper with Ubuntu as a word and a concept means I am because you are, I am only because you are, we are. And so Ubuntu expresses something deeply profound, right? That our humanity is interdependent and relational, right? I can't be human all by myself. My humanity is bound up, is tied to yours. And because it is bound up, tied to yours, interwoven with yours, how I treat you not only is about who I am, it's about who we are, right? By denying you respect, I deny myself respect. By denying your humanity, I erode my own, right? My humanity is deeply intermeshed with yours. When we have that conception, right, of ourselves, I think the world is better, right? Because that understanding of the world is rooted in a deep compassion, a compassion that steers us away from violence, away from ignorance, away from intolerance, and toward deep compassion for each other because we see ourselves and our lives and our histories as intimately connected and interdependent. And so for me, trying to see that understanding of the world is what healing history is all about, is what I sort of talk about, even hell, I talk in a lot of churches, preach about, is centering Ubuntu in how we engage with each other dialogically in dialogue, but also how we understand our history, right, as interconnected and interdependent. Not Black history over there, American history over here, African history over there. No, we have a common origin story. And so that is, I think, those kinds of perspectives are liberating perspectives, transformative perspectives that if we can weave them into identities in our everyday lives, I think they transform how we treat each other.
Yeah. All right. This year marks the 100th year of formally celebrating the history of African Americans in the United States. Why do you
Yes,
think
sir.
we have been able to perpetuate this tradition?
Well, the reason why we are able to perpetuate this tradition of recalling and reclaiming our past is because we never lost it. We never lost our history. Our history has been suppressed. Our history has been demonized. Our history has been minimized, but we never lost our sense of identity, and in not losing a sense of our identity, our history. You know, to understand Black history and how it survived slavery, and not only survived slavery, thrived under slavery, that becomes the basis for a Black identity today. What we have to understand about the Black past, the African past, is that it was an oral past. It was transmitted, preserved, and perpetuated into the future orally, and not just orally, through our names, through our traditions, through our food ways, right? Our history is encoded in the very experience, in the very day-to-day life, the mundane day-to-day life of Black people. Our history was encoded in the practices, encoded in the names. And so we didn't forget those things. Those things survived and thrived in these Americas and became the basis for not only a common history back in Africa, but a common experience in America. And so the history was never lost because it was a part of us. It was a living, breathing history found in our clothing, found in how we do, how we curate our hair, like how we tell stories through song. The history was in the songs. The history was in the songs, my dear brother. And so the history was never lost because it never needed to be on paper, in books. The books were forbidden from reading, but yet our history survived because it wasn't textual. It was a living history. And so you had to kill Black people to kill the history. You couldn't kill Black people because they were worth too much as enslaved people. And so the history lived. And we have Black History Month not because the history died, because the history was being suppressed in American education. Therefore, Carter G. Woodson, a Black historian, I would say the father of Black history, as to give him his respect, saw a problem in not our traditions, but in American institutions who suppressed, marginalized, demonized that history. It was in that space that Black history has done its work, not because the history had been forgotten and lost by Black people. No, 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 no. No, no, no. And so it's not a miracle to me, right, that we have a deep pride and a deep historical connection to that history, because that is the Black experience, right? However, yes, when it comes to these American institutions, we need a Black History Month, right? We are not represented well, right, in educational settings, especially with the erasure that's happening today. And so for me, I understand our history as a living history. It lives in our practices, in our food ways, in our phraseology, right, in Black vernacular, right? And that is as vibrant as ever, right? And if you ever want to understand our history, there's so many portals to the past, right? Hip hop is such a portal to our past, right? If you just understand the hip hop as the art form and as a container for our history, it'll never be lost. And so for me, for me, the question isn't were how were we able to preserve it? The question really is how has the history been suppressed so well in these American institutions? How did that project become so successful when you have, the legacy of contributions and significance that Black people have made to if we're just thinking about the American past and not world history, it's impossible to talk about it. And so we're really doing a lot of damage, in other words, by conveniently excluding Black people, marginalizing them from the history. That's a societal, systemic issue in society, but not one that begins or ends with Black people and how Black people have remained connected, deeply connected to their 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 identity, and through that identity, their history.
Yeah. So I think you kind of led into this question. Every year, some white people go into public square and complain about the celebration of Black history. How do you answer the question, why a Black History Month?
Why a Black History Month? Why are we focusing on Black history? Why does Black people deserve a month? Right? I would agree with them. We need a year. We don't let's not be mad about a month. Let's get mad about a year devoted to Black people. Let's ante up. But seriously, I think when people are angry, especially white people are angry about our focus on Black History Month, or why those stories, those narratives are emphasized. I think it's often from a place of indifference, right? It's from a place of not only indifference, but indifference rooted in ignorance. And sometimes it's not indifference rooted in ignorance, it is true hostility rooted in a real troubled relationship with the Black past, a relationship that they may feel guilty about, a relationship that they may feel uneasy about, right? But there is a reason for that disavowal. It's not just disavowal because it's rooted to an experience. It's rooted to a relationship. And one has to confront that relationship, right? I believe if you want to get to a place where you can appreciate, where you can acknowledge, where you can see, right, the impact and think about it compassionately. And so that is the kind of identity work that I do or I try to do. But I know those ideas, those feelings are rooted in a kind of experience. And if you grow up in America and you experience American education that marginalizes for the most part the Black experience in how it educates, students about American history, you can kind of understand the indifference. You can kind of understand the hostility because they've never been told that this is important. These people matter. Their histories matter. And so when you've never been told that, but then you're bombarded with it, there is resistance, there is reluctance, there is indifference. My role as educator, whether you're Black, you're white, you're indigenous, or otherwise, is to overcome that indifference, right? Through education, through knowledge, and most importantly, understanding why we care about that knowledge of, and that history of, and that experience of Black people. Understanding why we care is what is most transformative about education, not the simple transmittal of knowledge, the simple transmittal of knowledge through reading and discourse, but it's in us understanding why we care that transforms indifference to empowerment, indifference to compassion. And so for me, it's ultimately the relationship that white people have to not only the Black past, but to the American past. And so for me, again, I teach from this place that it's not good enough to teach people about Black people. We have to teach them that they have always already have a relationship to the Black past. The only question is whether you care about it or not, and how do you care about it? And so those are the profound questions that not just white people have to answer, Black people, everybody has to answer that question if they're going to truly understand what I believe I understand is that our histories are intertwined and interconnected, not separate, not parochial, not nationalistic, right? Just like our humanity is intertwined and interdependent, our histories are too. And the recognition of that and activating that, operationalizing that, and how we talk about our past, how we treat each other because we understand the past in that way is what, for me, again, healing history is all about, right? Us developing a compassionate relationship to our many pasts, but certainly the Black past. Does that make sense, dear brother?
Yes, sir. Henry Louis Gates said the thing about Black history is that the truth is so much more complex than anything you can make up. Do you agree with that statement?
Woo! I love Henry Louis Gates. I know he's not beloved by all, but he does say some really profound and powerful things. I do agree that the Black experience gives us more mystery than it does revelations. I say that not just because Black history and the history of Africa has been marginalized in Western accounts. I say that because of the vastness of Black history. Black history is vast. It encompasses the African past. And when we think about the Black past and the African past together, that represents not just the last 500 years of human history, that represents 7 million years of human history. When I think about the Black past, I think about it as 7 million years of continuous history. And the vast majority of that 7 million years, we know very little about. And so, as much as Africa reveals about who we are all out of Africa. There are so many questions and mysteries that we have not unraveled because of the vastness of that history and the fragmentary nature of how we know that history through fossil evidence, through genetic evidence, and in the last 10,000 years, invention of writing, right, through textual sources, but fragmentary, right? The vastness of the African past has revealed a lot, right? But it's still shrouded in deep mystery. And so I think of it as a universe that we constantly explore, but we will never ever know. Just like space is the vastness of space, we will continuously explore, but we will only be able to see the visible universe and understand the visible universe, not the universe in all its entirety, not in all of its glory. It's simply too big. And so I feel the same way about African history. And so when Henry Louis Gates would say that, that's where my mind and body go. And that, for me, gives Africa its deepest reverence and sacred nature. It is so vast. We can never know it all. But what we do know about it, and what I seize upon, is Africa as motherland of humanity. And as motherland of humanity, no matter if you're black, you're white, or otherwise, you have a deep and profound relationship to Africa. Now, whether you care about that relationship is something different, but you always already have a relationship with Africa and the African past. 7 million years of human history. Africa represents the vast majority of human history, most of which happened on the continent. Only in the last 100 to 50,000 years have humans dispersed from Africa. And the modern world, if we can say, after the dispersal, has only been in the last 100,000 years. 7 million years was on the continent. And so when we think about Africa in that way, if we are indifferent to it, we are indifferent to ourselves. If we are hostile to it, we're hostile to ourselves because we are not recognizing how deeply connected we are to Africa as not just the Black people's motherland, all of us. It's our motherland, right? That's a profound idea that is not found in American education. But what if it was?
Speaking about American education, the word black was banned from a Black History flyer at an HBCU. Your thoughts?
I don't like it. I'm proud to be Black with the capital B. And I'm never not going to be proud of being Black with the capital B, even with all the complexities of how I think about my identity and its connection to other people, other communities. Blackness beyond history is a lived experience. And that lived experience we are building upon the shoulders of our ancestors. They have passed down that culture to us as an inheritance. Ubuntu is a part of our inheritance, passed down orally for generations, for centuries, that has structured the Black experience. When we talk about lift every voice and sing, that's Ubuntu. When we say lifting as we climb, that's Ubuntu. And so that is an experience, a Black experience that I will never, ever turn against. And I'm never going to be okay with people turning against, especially Black institutions, right, that have over their history preserved Black history and Black culture, projected Black history and Black culture, uplifted Black people. I'm never going to accept them banning Black, capital B. No, why? How? Who? For what reason? For what reason? You're going to deny that ancestry, that cultural inheritance? For what? For Donald Trump? You're crazy.
Well, speaking about Donald Trump, what signal does it send when the current administration makes a concerted effort to remove historical artifacts pertaining to African Americans?
We have to resist. We have to organize and resist. Our history will not be removed by removing artifacts. Let's be clear about that. Our history ain't going nowhere. But in American institutions, you can try to erase it. But our history ain't going nowhere as long as we here. Our history is not just preserved in museums and libraries and in books. It is a part of us. And so you have to get rid of Black people to get rid of Black history because we are rooted in it, we are guided by it, and we created through cultural practices and traditions. It ain't going nowhere. I'm not worried about it like that. But what I am worried about is the damage that removing it from the Smithsonian does, right, to education, to students, right? The kind of historical amnesia it will create and the kind of harm that it will do in terms of the hostilities and indifference that I talked about. I'm worried about it in that way, but not in a way that our history is going to some kind of way shrink away and it loses its vitality because it ain't in the Smithsonian. It serves a real important role with it being there, but it's not the end all be all. It's not keeping me up at night because I know there are Black institutions like HBCUs. There are Black cultural museums where this history will continue to live. But more importantly, it's going to live in us. It's going to live in our traditions, and it's going to live, and it's going to outlive it's going to outlive these efforts to ban it, to minimize it, etc. And so our history is too vast. Like I said, it's too vast to suppress it. You can try to ban it, but a ban cannot erase 7 million years of history. It just can't. And so when you come from that place, yeah, it's alarming, but it ain't no way in the world you can erase the Black experience. Too central. You can't even talk about world history without Black people. You can't even, my grandmother would say, you can't even fix your mouth to talk about. She said, you can't fix your mouth to talk about me or to talk about my people like that because it ain't true. And so that's the deep, deep, deep faith that I have in our culture and our traditions. And they are under threat, but they are not going anywhere.
So what more can we do as a community to preserve our heritage?
Build community. Build community. We have the most amazing historical legacy. We have the most vast cultural inheritance, African history. And when I say vast, I truly mean in the most profound way, human beings learn how to be human on the continent of Africa. We need to recognize that deep heritage and build community around it. That goes for Black people and all other people, right? I truly believe this, and this is just me going as deep as I can on this question. I truly believe if skin color differences have been the basis of modern identities, you're a white person, you're a Black person, you're a brown, if skin color difference has been the basis of modern identities, structured society, and its institutions, and we've seen how divisive, how oppressive, and how much harm that has done, if we can embrace our shared African origin and truly care about that and let that idea transform us, we can create a new, liberating identity rooted in what we share, not what makes us different. But in order for that to happen, we have to free our African mind. And until we free our African mind, as Black people and all other people, I think we're stuck in these identities that pit us against each other versus bring us together. My sincere hope and where I teach from, where I'm at, and how I organize is from that place. It's from the deepest ancestral place I think I can go. I believe that idea is not just a good idea. I believe it's a healing idea. It can heal us in recognizing common humanity and just how intimately interconnected we are, our shared African origin. for me, that's a healing history. And what needs to happen is we need to dialogue about that endlessly. We need to center it so much that we dialogue about it endlessly. And as a society, come to an understanding about why we care about that and how, because we care about that, that's transformative for how we're going to live together. See, it's all about that.
Yeah. All right. Last question.
Yes, sir.
And I've been asking all my guests this question this year. Finish this sentence. I have
Yes, sir.
hope because
I'm a humanist. Hey, I have hope in humanity. I don't just study humanity. I actually love people. I truly embrace the idea that a human is a human through other people, right? I can't be human all by myself. I can't even have joy all by myself because I want to share it with somebody. And so I have the deepest faith in humanity, and not in humanity getting it right, but I have the deepest faith in humanity because of how we are human because of each other, right? We have survived and thrived not because of survival of the fittest, but it's been the survival of the friendliest. We have actually helped each other. Human beings couldn't have survived the rigors of the African continent, the gradations in weather, the extreme weather, the hot seasons, the dry seasons, without cooperation. To be human is to profoundly depend on others. And because you depend on others, you cooperate. And so that is what roots my humanism, why I have a deep love for humanity, because I know at our core, we are human because we cooperated with each other and we survived. And we were able to, because we survived, we were able to thrive when we figured out how to work together. That didn't mean that we worked all the way together. There's slavery, there's oppression, there's all kinds of things. But that's not why we survived. That's how we began to oppress. And so when we think about the long durée of world history, African history, we survived because we cooperated with each other. And so at my core, I believe that people cooperate versus structure or prefer to be in conflict with people. And so and because of that, I love people on their worst day and I love people on their best day. And so my profound hope is in people, not in technology. Some people think technology is the driving force of history. I believe compassion is the driving force of history, not technology. And so these are fundamentally humanist values, right? Believing in people, right? Loving people, believing in us on our worst day. Loving people when we ascend Mount Kilimanjaro. That's great. But even when we engage in horrific acts, trying to find compassion so that we can transform that relationship is what, for me, it is all about. And so I'm hopeful in humans. That's why I'm a Black humanist. And I believe, and Ubuntu, to go back to Ubuntu, is for me the greatest expression of humanism. That tradition, that thought tradition. Ubuntu is the root of it, but it's also the greatest expression of it. And so that's for me why I keep that centered. It's not just a talking point. It's truly how to live life in line with our ancestral heritage. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. That makes a whole lot of sense. Dr. Karlos K. Hill, how can people reach out to you if they want to get some more of this wisdom?
Dear brother Erik, it's easy to find me. You just got to email me at Karlos. You can actually go to my website, karloskhill.com, and from there you can very easily send me an email and or connect with American Program Bureau, who represents me and organizes, lectures and workshops that I do. And so either my website or American Program Bureau, go on their website. You can find me there, or just email me at carlos.hill@ou.edu. I answer all emails. So if you email me, I will respond. It may take a month, but I will get back to you. But no, I'm easy to find, and I'm a community engaged Black Studies historian, right? So it's not a inconvenience for me. It's actually the work for me. And so engaging with people that don't encounter me in the classroom, engaging them wherever they are, is what for me community engaged really means.
Well, Brother Karlos, considering the significance of this year being
Yes,
the
sir.
100th year of commemorating and celebrating Black history, I am so glad I was able to lock you in and to have you come and talk about this. I don't think I could have found a better person or a more articulate person
Lord have mercy.
to break down the significance of this month, what it means to us and what it's meant to us for this last century. So thank you so much, man. And I apologize for all the technical stuff.
It was me, dear brother.
But I'm glad we got through it, man. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate you. Much success on the current academic year too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think you and your questions bring out the best of me. They are profound questions. You have a profound voice and sharing with the community. So every time you invite me, I get excited. And I want to share as deeply and as compellingly as I can, because I know you have an audience of people who really value your perspective. So again, thank you. And I look forward, dear brother, for us to come back together. Hopefully it's not, a year from now. Maybe it's, in a few months we can chat again, but maybe around Juneteenth. Let's do a Juneteenth one. Let's talk during Juneteenth time.
All right. We'll. I'm gonna get you in.
Okay.
I got some folks lined up, but I'm gonna get you in there. All right.
All right, dude.
We'll make it a gala.
Okay. Hey, I appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys. We're gonna catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So let me thank Dr. Decoteau Irby, Dr. Ann Ishimaru, and Dr. Karlos K. Hill for coming on the program. It's pretty cool to have all those smart people be guests on the podcast, and I greatly appreciate all the work that they are doing to educate our young folks, right? Our future leaders. For Dr. Irby and Dr. Ishimaru, please get their book, Doing the Work of Equity Leadership for Justice and Systems. This was nearly a decade in the making, and it's really, really a positive book in the sense that even though it highlights some struggles and challenges, it's important to know that there are people that have dedicated their lives to make sure that our students are in safe spaces, that they are comfortable in their learning environments. And I only expect great things to come from the research that Dr. Irby and Dr. Ishimaru have put in. And for Dr. Karlos Hill, this is his second time on the podcast. And like I told him, I his thoughtfulness and his enthusiasm and his passion, I think really encapsulates why it's important for us to celebrate Black History Month, and especially since we have been celebrating it now for 100 years in this country. I just really, really am grateful that he was able to carve out some time to make this happen. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had to put this together. Them gremlins be out there. And especially, I was just thinking, oh yeah, they doing their best, and technology's is supposed to be neutral and all that, but sometimes I just feel there's some interviews that's harder to record than others. But we pushed through it, and hopefully that you were able to get the gist of what we talked about in the interview, because it was very, very profound what Dr. Hill said, especially in this contrarian era that we are in, right? Because, some people say counterculture and all that stuff, but this is just being contrarian. And there are some Black people who, when I watch what they post and their political commentary, that's the first word that comes to my mind. They're just not happy with anything. It's one thing to be upset about the politics that are out there, but it's a whole nother thing to just be upset about everything, even the progressive stuff, even the good things. They just always finding fault. There's this one sister, my God, I don't even know if she would support Jesus if he came. That's how contrarian she is. I follow her just to see to what level she can go, right? But just like a broken clock, at least twice a day, it's going to give you the correct time. So, and you try to support people, especially your own people. But I just, some days I just be like, really? That's what you got out of all of that? Or are you that narrow-minded, right, that you can't just accept a win? And we've had to navigate that as Black people throughout, right? She's not what people would describe as a sellout. She's not a sellout by any means. She's pro-Black, but it just seemed like she ain't never gonna be happy. Or maybe she is happy just being contrary. I don't know. I don't understand the mindset of those folks. And, maybe I'm not Black enough to understand that. I don't know. But I don't really like contrarian people anyway, because they always cause problems. And, we are quickly, people talk about being an authoritarian society and, the end of democracy and all that. But what leads to that is being contrary, just being angry and dissident about everything. They accuse Black folks of that. But one of the good things about Black History Month is that it reminds the nation that we are far from contrary as a people. We are the conscience of America. We are the epitome of what the American ideal is, right? For a group of people to be enslaved, to have one of their descendants become president of the United States, right? And the first lady, I think it's just, it's amazing. People say, well, his folks are mixed, whatever, man. You know what I'm saying? It's like to see one of us in the White House. That was a major moment. You can deny it if you want to. You can Monday morning quarterback about how effective it was. But my child got to see that. And, and I was in the middle of all that. I was running for office myself during that time. So, yeah, there's nothing you can say to dissuade me about the positive impact of that and how it shows how persistent, despite the contrary attitude of America, that we have succeeded, right? But this contrarianism leads to authoritarianism. And it was in total display over the last week, with the Super Bowl. And you had this guy come on who is literally the most popular musical artist in the world right this minute, agree to do the halftime show at the Super Bowl. And all these contrarians kept talking about, well, he is not in English and, oh, it's not American and blah, blah, blah. This dude is more American than you are because he believes in hope. He believes in love. And Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. I don't know if they want to be, if you understand the history. We took them over, I guess, during the Spanish-American War and, as far as colonizing them. And, there's a sector of them that have been pushing for independence, even violently, right? I grew up in Chicago. So if you understand Chicago history, you understand how the quest for Puerto Rican independence impacted our city, right? So, it was a beautiful show. And even if you're not fluent in Spanish, you got the gist of it. The visual, and, he was very sensitive about that. The only thing I was disappointed about the show was that I saw that people were the grass. And I was just saying, ooh, if the grass dances, this would be the greatest show ever. But the grass didn't dance, but there was some symbolism behind that as far as how the natives or the inhabitants of Puerto Rico would hide from their oppressors in that grass. So it's like, okay, I get it, right? And, there's that symbolism about grassroots, right? So, but the contrarians wanted to do their own Super Bowl show. And it was terrible from all aspects, from the talent that they put together to it just wasn't even a comparison. The only thing that would make anybody that's contrarian happy is that they got to see a lot of red, white, and blue, and people performed in English. That's it. I mean, the quality of the songs, and to give Kid Rock his respect, he had one hit song. So, for those who like that song, it was good that he performed that. But outside of that, it was almost like Star Search that nobody got disqualified from, right? Or Showtime at Apollo and the Sandman didn't come with the hook. That's the only difference, right? So it is what it is. I mean, I don't want to disparage artists, but if you signed up for that, you don't really give a damn about me or anybody else. So if I hurt your feelings, so be it, right? But, all this contrarian behavior leads to dysfunction, and it leads to incompetence, and it leads to buffoonery, right? And there was no greater example of that than when the so-called Attorney General of the United States of America, Pam Bondi, who, I don't know how y'all view people, but I'm older than Pam. And, I don't know. I mean, but I guess when you are oppressed, when you're under a lot of stress, your whole complexion, your whole demeanor, your physical presence changes. And if you're not in good spirit, because being contrarian truly means that you don't have a good spirit. And there's something that's troubling you to the point where you can't see joy, or you can't conduct yourself in a manner with composure and dignity, right? And I mean, I don't know, Some people say, well, you talking about how she looks. It's like, look at all of them. Look at all of them. The three gentlemen that represented ICE and the Border Patrol, they have aged considerably. And I know at least two of those guys are younger than me, right? Maybe all three of them, if they're not younger, they're about my age. But I think they're all younger than me, and they look like they just came out of serving in both the Korean, the Vietnam, and even the Afghanistan war, like right off the battlefield. Like they've just aged that much because they're dealing with being, I think the phrase is out of their skis or over their skis, whatever, right? They're playing at a level above their pay grade or their skill set. And that's stress. But contrarianism leads to incompetence, leads to dysfunction, leads to mismanagement, just everything, right? Because if you're not in a good place mentally, you're not going to do good things. You're just not. But getting back to Pam Bundy, the foolishness of that. And I know everybody has talked about it all week and all this stuff, but as somebody that has actually participated in a hearing to ask people questions, to hear testimony, to try to get a better understanding of legislation or how a particular agency works, why should we do this, why we shouldn't do this, having been a witness at a hearing, given written testimony, oral testimony, it was literally the worst display I have ever seen of a government official addressing Congress. And it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. That should not be acceptable. Now, I understand that people are trying to disbar her in Florida. And the only reason why that hasn't happened is because the bar has said we try not to do that when people are in positions. And maybe that's why Florida has decided that they're not going to be a part of the ABA, the American Bar Association, anymore, because I'm sure the American Bar Association is kind of like, I don't see a problem with you getting rid of this person, even if they are the Attorney General. I don't see why they shouldn't be disbarred. Basically, the way they're acting in that position is the reason why they should be disbarred, right? Because, I've never heard of that in any other state, and maybe that's why Texas did the same thing as far as any of their affiliation with the ABA, but, because I'm sure there's been complaints about Ken Paxton. I don't even know if Greg Abbott is an attorney. Well, yeah, he's an attorney. I'm sure there's been some bar complaints about him, right? If there haven't been any complaints, it should be, right? Because the whole purpose of practicing law is, above all else, upholding it, right? Even the people that defend folks that have been accused of crimes, they are upholding the law. They are upholding the Constitution because they're providing counsel for the defense, right? So there's a standard that is applied to people that are in that profession, that are in that practice, just like any other profession. If a doctor yelled at other doctors while they're performing surgery the way that Pam Bondi did, probably would lose his license. If a teacher yelled at students the way that Pam Bondi did, probably would not be in a classroom much longer. Hell, we've seen coaches get fired at all levels based on the way that they communicated with their players, right? There's a line There's a level of professionalism that you have to have. And to be in a culture where you think that acting that way is cool, because she had this smirk on her face, just like Scott Jennings has this smirk on his face on CNN, and that contrarian confidence, which is the ultimate oxymoron, right? You know, that, I got those liberals, right? I got those folks that don't agree with our position. I showed them. You showed how much of an ass you were. That's all you did. That's all you did. And it was an embarrassment. Even to the people that you pissed off, they were embarrassed that it got to that point. You're sitting up here talking about the Dow Jones Index and the S&P, and the whole purpose of the hearing was to determine, what are you doing to help the survivors of the worst sex trafficking ring in world history, right? We're trying to find out, what have you found out about this guy Epstein, who's no longer with us? You know, how he became a multimillionaire off of trafficking young women, and who all was involved, who all needs to take accountability for that, right? Because some people are catching it now. You know, a young woman just retired from a law firm because she was giving Epstein legal advice without the firm's knowledge. So she's gone. A guy who used to be an economic advisor to a president, he's basically gone into hiding, gave up his position at an Ivy League school because of his connection. We've got people in the cabinet, next door neighbors, bought a house from Epstein after he was convicted in 2008 for doing the same thing, prostitution of a child. And all these members of Congress were trying to do was to find out where you at in the case. If they wanted to know about the Dow Jones and its impact, that's what Secretary Bessent is for. He's the Treasury guy. They could have got Epstein's neighbor, Lutnick, to come in, the commerce guy. But he made his money off the stock. Let's ask him about the importance of the stock market. They're not asking the Attorney General of the United States about the stock market. Nobody's there to talk about that. There are women in the audience that were victims or survivors. They want to hear what you're doing to help them. And, you said, well, you didn't ask that about the previous Attorney General. You didn't ask the Attorney General before that, the Attorney General before that. No, I guess they didn't. Because for some reason, I think people thought it was kind of handled after 2008. And now we're realizing that it got worse. So, it's like one survivor said, we've been looking for justice for 30 years. So, yeah, there's a lot of attorney generals that have been there in the last 30 years. But guess what? You're the attorney general right now. So it doesn't matter about the other folks. What you doing? The ball is in your court. If that's something you can't handle, then maybe you should step aside and let somebody that can handle it. But in this contrarian environment we're in, her foolishness, her buffoonery, her brazen disrespect is okay. And that should be a problem for all of us, right? Now, if you're cynical about stuff, well, they're not going to get anything done. Well, it's hard to argue when stuff hadn't been done in 30 years. I get that. But it's not acceptable to be contrarian and just act a fool when people ask you questions about it. That's not owning anything. And like I've said before, slavery's over with, so we don't own human beings. Just don't. You can have your opinion. I can disagree with it. Keep it moving. But it's like, you just basically said, look, We're doing the best we can. Apologize that it's not going as fast as some of y'all want. I apologize that the survivors are feeling that they're not getting the justice they deserve, but we're doing the best we can to finally put some closure on this and to hold people accountable. If she had just repeated that every time somebody asked her a question, that would have been more acceptable than her trying to literally have a book that supposedly had got you moments for each member of Congress that she or the president doesn't like. And then we find out in the book that the members of Congress that went to actually look at the unredacted files, she actually had a page or a book that broke down what files they pulled up. So we're being nosy. That's what surveillance is. We're being nosy. Oh, I want to see what this representative looked at. I want to see what does it matter? You opened it up so that they could look at all of them. You put out 3 million pages. So you want to see, what are you trying to see which ones are popular, which ones are not? Right? I am sure that if a member of Congress read something in the files that they want further questions about, they know how to get in contact with you. How do I know that? Because they put out a book. It's a congressional directory. It's a huge book. And it's got the phone numbers, direct phone numbers of every person in government. It's got the direct number to the Attorney General. If they wanted to contact you, they'll call you. You ain't got to spy on them to figure out what they're looking at. That's crazy, right? But, that was all like, I guess to, embarrass them or I don't know. All I know is that contrarian behavior is not going to move this country forward. Foolishness is not going to move this country forward. Pettiness is not going to move this country forward. Revenge is not going to move this country forward. That was the case, then Martin Luther King would be known as revolutionary. Malcolm X actually would have been shooting people, right? That's not how this works. We are here to express ideals and to build on hope, not despair, not to play on fear, not to play the dozens with grown folks. That's not how we function effectively. Our job is to do our job and do it to the best of our ability. That's why you take an oath before you start working on the job, because you are making a verbal commitment that you're going to do the best that you can do within the confines of the Constitution of the United States and the laws thereof. Period. If you cannot do that job, step aside and let somebody who is capable step in. Yeah, there's a lot of power and prestige, and the title sounds awesome, but it ain't about the glitz and the glamour. It's about the work. And if you're unwilling to do the work, that's just not for Ms. Bundy. That's for everybody that's in the cabinet. That's for the president himself. If you're not willing to do the work, step aside and let somebody else do the work that's capable of doing it, that has the professionalism to do it, that has the temperament to do it. If you are triggered because somebody asked you as the Attorney General of the United States to look at the survivors of the worst sex trafficking ring in the history of the world, that triggers you. This is not the job for you. You've been an Attorney General for a state. You've been a prosecutor. You have dealt with victims and survivors. You have dealt with criminals, right? What's different than this? The magnitude of it, the people that might be involved. It is what it is. If you can't handle it, step aside. And if you're offended by what I say, so be it. I've been in situations where they asked me to resign, right? I've made mistakes being an elected official, but I was accountable for it. And for 9 years, I served. And when the people decided it's time for Mr. Fleming to go to the House, they sent me home. When I asked to be a United States Senator, the majority of people decided to keep the guy they had. It is what it is. I'm not mad about that. I'm disappointed. Yeah, I was disappointed then. I'm a little disappointed now. But that doesn't make me a contrarian. That didn't create this mindset in me that I'm just going to destroy the system because I can't get what I want, which is exactly what's going on with this administration. They are systematically destroying the very institution that it took 250 years to build. We are celebrating 250 years of being a country, and we have an administration that's just trying to destroy all of that for whatever personal, petty reason they've got. We got a man who did something that only one other human being has done. Run for president, win the presidency, lose the next election, come back the following election, and win. Only one other human being has done that. And Grover Cleveland didn't go around, at least not from any accounts I've seen, saying, well, I won the other election. They stole it from me. And that was at a time where he could have served multiple terms. He could have served 3 terms in a row. But he served 1 term, lost the election, came back the following election, and won. But now this president can't get over the fact that the people rejected him, right? He can't get over the fact that nearly 60% of the population can't stand him now after he won the election. Literally a year after he won, now everybody's like buyer's remorse because you're not doing the job. You're not doing what you said you were going to do. Well, outside of the crazy mass deportation thing. And that's only because you got a zealot like Stephen Miller in your ear pushing it. That's it. Because if you had competent people running it, you could probably pull that off without killing people in Minnesota or shooting people in Chicago or dropping helicopters in Chicago, right? Repelling from helicopters and arresting children. You wouldn't be staging military maneuvers in a park in downtown Los Angeles. You do the job. I've had a Border Patrol agent who wrote a book about the horrors and the struggles that they have dealing with the cartels and smuggling people across the border. We know it's not an easy job. And so what you got to do on the border, on the southern border of the United States to deal with that, you really have the latitude to do that. Nobody's really arguing with you about it, especially those of us that have a law enforcement background. We get it. But you can't do that in Chicago. You can't do that in Minneapolis. Can't do that in New York. Can't do that in Los Angeles. You can't even do that in Jackson, Mississippi. You can't do that. You got to have a different approach. And if you are trying to get the worst of the worst out, which is what you said, Mr. President, then you got people that can do that without, and you got other agencies to help you. The FBI deals with criminals every day. DEA deals with criminals every day, especially in the drug enforcement thing. You've got ATF, if you were ever funded, but now I think they've actually merged that in with the DEA somehow. You could develop a strategy that doesn't terrorize citizens to accomplish what you want. And even though the Supreme Court said racial profiling is okay, you probably shouldn't practice that. You probably shouldn't be stopping and frisking and detaining people of color just because. We literally have a Russian mafia in the United States of America. Why are we not deporting these people? Right? if you're going after the worst of the worst. Armenians, whoever. If they didn't exist, we wouldn't even have all these movies out, TV shows. I'm just saying, if you're trying to get the worst of the worst, you might want to go after them too. All I'm saying is that at this particular point in time, I'm hoping that this whole Pam Bondi thing conveys a message that we have to do better. Even if we have disagreements on issues and strategies of how to deal with issues, right? Because the contrarian thing, it just doesn't work. Y'all remember American fries? Of course not, because it was contrarian. Do you remember they came out with a W ketchup to counter John Kerry because John Kerry married the heiress to the Heinz ketchup portion? Y'all remember W? Of course not, because it was contrarian. It doesn't matter. Contrarian doesn't sell. Hope sells. Competent sells. Right? Competence, I should say, sells. Being functional, being professional, that sells. That foolishness that happened this week, starting with the halftime, the all-American, quote-unquote, halftime show, we got to do better, y'all. We got to do better. And as a society, our obligation is to demand better. If you want to be entertained, and Mark Burnett, wherever you are, if you hear this, I have always blamed you for the devolution of American culture. Ever since that first episode of Survivor showed up, right? And you created this monster, Donald Trump. So I'll never have any high regard for you. Now, you've made your money. You could care less about my opinion, but just understand there's at least one American who thinks that you contributed to the destruction of our culture. And, and now we have a creature from your creation running the country, and people are being entertained, right? There's no secret that people like foolishness on TV, but it shouldn't be in our government, right? If you go to local cities, the city councils that are constantly fighting each other, that's the most highly watched show in that demographic because people are acting foolish. And just like we like looking at car wrecks, we like looking at people crashing out. It's human nature. But government is not supposed to be entertaining. Government actually is supposed to be boring. That's why only a select few people get chosen to handle that. And the rest of us lives our lives. We're hoping that the decisions that you make don't impact our lives in such a way where we got to ask some questions and make some decisions about the leadership. Right? Government is supposed to be boring. It's not supposed to be entertaining. And the sooner we get that, the sooner we can stop the foolishness that we saw up there on Capitol Hill. The sooner we can get competent people elected to office. All right. That's all I got. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.